Hey y'all, I'm Paul Bonzer and I'm back with another project. Today I'm going to show you how I made these floating shelves. We needed some bookshelves for our home offices, but none of the readily available commercial options had built-in side supports, so I threw together a quick proof of concept with some crate boards I had handy. It seemed promising, so I picked up a few 1x8 pine common boards from a local home center. I also picked up a single 1x10 board for a couple of deeper shelves. I took my time digging through for boards which were relatively straight and straight-grained, and chose boards with a few big knots over lots of small knots to add a little character. The first step was cutting the bottom and side pieces on the chop saw. I clamped down a cutoff from the scrap bucket as an end stop to get consistent length on my pieces. I cut the long pieces 2 feet long and the side pieces 7 inches long. Since the boards were just wider than the capacity of my saw, the stop block helped to ensure that the cuts would line up when I flipped the boards over to do a second cut. For the wider boards, I used a stop block for the side pieces, but since there was only one cut to do for the longer pieces, I just marked and lined those up by eye. The shelves are hung by keyhole slots cut into the backs of the side pieces. This allows them to be hung without any visible hardware and without having to buy special floating shelf hardware either. I cut the slots on my router table, lining up the edges of each piece with the same marks on the table, dropping the edge onto the spinning router bit, then sliding to another mark on the table. I then slid the piece back a little so it was no longer cutting, then held it in place with one hand while turning the router table off with the other hand. One key thing to keep in mind while making cuts like this, or any cut on a router table, is to always be aware of where your hands are and where they would go if a piece slipped in any way. I always keep my hands away from the bit and brace them in such a way that if they were to slip, my hands would not move toward the spinning bit. Because I had to flip the boards to finish the cuts, there were a few uneven spots where the cuts didn't perfectly line up. I cleaned up those spots on my large disc sander. I considered doing some fancier joinery, but I decided I would rather have the shelves done quickly, so I went for biscuits, which are quite strong and pretty quick to do. The shelves could just as easily be built with dowels or pocket hole screws, but I like the fully hidden joinery to go along with the fully hidden method of hanging. I started by marking the locations of the slots on the side pieces. I started cutting the slots, and I got 4 slots in before I realized the mistake that I was making. The slots on the sides were supposed to be in the sides of the boards, not the ends. I glued some biscuits into the misplaced slots to fill in the holes. I used a square to transfer all of the marks to the correct side for lining up with the line on my biscuit joiner, and then cut the slots on the correct sides. I marked and cut the slots in the bottom pieces without incident. Once the glue was dry on my patch biscuits, I trimmed those flush and cut the correct biscuit slots in them. After cutting all the slots, I sanded all the pieces with 80 grit, 150 grit, and then 220 grit sandpaper. I used my random orbit sander on the faces and hand sanded on the edges. After a quick dusting off, I was ready to glue my shelves up. I started by applying masking tape next to all the areas which would have glue applied to catch any squeeze out and to save me from having to do more sanding in the future. I applied glue to the faces, making sure to get enough into the biscuit slots, inserted the biscuits, and put everything together. I added some clamps to hold the pieces tight and overcome some slight cupping that some of the pieces had. I checked for square and offset the center and edge clamps a little to either side to pull the joints as square as possible. After the recommended 30 minutes of clamp time, I removed the clamps and peeled off the masking tape. I used a scraper that uses these plastic straight razor blades to clean off some drips and get all the squeeze out from the corners. Even though the blades are plastic, they're still sharp enough to scratch soft pine, it turns out, but it's easier to avoid damage with these than with a metal tool. Doing this while the glue is still slightly pliable makes it easier to get the tape off and remove any extra squeeze out that may not have come off with the tape. To suspend the shelves for spraying on finish, I tied some string onto a loose drawer pull and made use of the keyhole slots. I used a matte clear lacquer finish, spraying on a few coats, lightly sanding with 220 grit sandpaper between coats. To hang the shelves, I held them in the position where I wanted them, used a level to ensure they were level, then traced the top edge and sides lightly with a pencil on the wall. I marked the center line, then measured from the top edge of the shelf to the tops of each of the holes and transferred those locations onto the wall as well. I used a pair of calipers to transfer the measurements, but you could also just use a ruler or measuring tape for the job. I used the style of wall anchors, which have large plastic screws that hold them into the drywall. They drill their own holes, so it was just a matter of putting the points on my marks and screwing them in. It took a little tweaking, but I was able to adjust the screws in the anchors to stick out just the right amount to hold the shelf flush against the wall. Once all the screws were adjusted properly, the shelf slipped onto them and locked into place in a very satisfying manner. And with that, I was ready to load the shelf up. The anchors I used are rated for up to 50 pounds each, so even with a large margin, they should be able to hold a full load of books without trouble. I think these shelves make a great weekend project, and it's pretty satisfying to see them up on the wall and know that I was able to make something that fit my needs perfectly. Let me know in the comments if you make a set of these yourself, or if you have any questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all next time.